Welcome, everyone. Perfect timing, everyone can grab your seats. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kadie Philp, and I'm the founder of the Garden of Even. This is an arts and literary project, but much more than that. It's rewriting or retelling the truth of women's stories in history. This is my second event. I am so honored to have such a wonderful crowd of friends and colleagues here to support it, and mentors. Minister Todd McCarthy was able to join us tonight. So the flow is going to be really interesting. We've got a great panel of discussion. Samantha Seabrook is going to provide a keynote address and really get into the meat and bones of the person's case and how that really transformed everything you know. The fact that I'm wearing a pantsuit and I have short hair and not being murdered for it can probably go back to it definitely goes back to Joan of Arc, which we'll get to later. So Samantha's going to open that up, and then we're inviting employers up to share what's actually happening in the workplace so we can see, because there's a lot of conversations about the pushback on DE&I, but there's also a lot of progress, and I think we have to celebrate that. No one wants to bet on a losing horse, so let's talk about what's working, and our employers will share that. Laura Williams will come up after the employer panel and share some commentary as a respondent to what she's heard, and then introduce me. I'll give a Garden of Even keynote on Joan of Arc and her radical journey to personhood. It's Joan's journey like you've never heard it before, I promise. And then we will wrap up and do the most important thing, which is celebrate being a person. Before we jump into the content, I would like to invite the Honorable Todd McCarthy to the stage. Todd is he's a great friend and mentor, so it's very hard when your friends and mentors are elevated with honorifics, and then you have to greet them with, sorry, Minister. Minister McCarthy is Minister of Public and Business Service Delivery and Procurement. Before his election in 2022, Todd was a well-respected and established lawyer in Durham and across Ontario. Minister McCarthy was called to the bar in 1989 and served as deputy judge from 2002 to 2011. And another honorific is that he's a friend and mentor to me. In fact, when I first had the idea of doing an event on Person's Day, I talked to a handful of friends, Angela Payne, Samantha, and Minister McCarthy, and when I called them and I said, what do you think? Do you know anything about this case? I mean, his enthusiasm was off the hook. So I thought, okay, there's an audience for this event if I can get every demographic interested in this case. So I'm so delighted to have Minister McCarthy share some thoughts on the case and his passion for the law. So I'd like to invite Mr. McCarthy up.
Thank you very much, Kadie, and each and every one of you. It's really an honor to be here, and it's true, I was absolutely off the charts thrilled when Kadie told me about this upcoming event because I believe so strongly in celebrating Person's Day as a landmark day in Canadian history. The case of Edwards and the Attorney General of Canada fundamentally changed the course of history, not only for women in Canada, but indeed for all Canadians. And I can say that as a former trial lawyer and a former deputy judge, and I love judges. I appeared in front of them for 3 decades. But there are 3 branches of government, and we need a conversation to get public policy just right on this important basis. Listen to the people. It's the people that drive democracy. The 3 branches of government neither collectively nor individually own democracy. The people are the people we are accountable to and who drive the democratic process and who make parliamentary democracy what it is. So, without being overly critical of that other branch of government, it's fair to say that courts can sometimes be spectacularly wrong. They can legally reason their way to bizarre conclusions, and sometimes err indeed on the wrong side of history, as our Supreme Court of Canada unanimously was in 1928. In 1927, the year before, 5 legendary Canadian women, Emily Murphy, Irene Parlby, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Edwards, note the name of the case is Edwards and the Attorney General of Canada, so Henrietta was the lead plaintiff. These Canadians wanted to see to it that a woman would be appointed to the Senate of Canada, and they petitioned the federal government to refer 2 questions on the matter for review to the Supreme Court of Canada. Legal eagles like myself will note that there's different ways you can get to the highest court in the land. You can start at the trial level and move up as you win or lose. Well, when you lose, you appeal. But you can also, the government of the day can refer a matter to the Supreme Court of Canada. The federal government can, and the provincial government can refer a matter to the Court of Appeal. The petition by these five great Canadian women led to then Justice Minister Ernest Lapointe, who was in the government of Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, led him to agree to refer a single question to the court for decision. And the question was this: does the word persons in section 24 of what we then called the British North America Act 1867 include female persons? A simple question, presumably a simple, straightforward, constitutionally correct answer could ensue, but not quite. On April 24, 1928, Chief Justice Francis Anglin of the Supreme Court of Canada handed down a decision stating, and I quote, that women are not eligible for appointment by the Governor-General to the Senate of Canada under Section 24 of our Constitution because they are not qualified persons. Now, Chief Justice Anglin was joined by way of concurring opinions by two of the five justices sitting on the court, and two other judges, including later Chief Justice Duff, came to the same result, but for different reasons. So you had varied reasons for a completely bizarre and unacceptable result, which shows that you can legally reason your way to some very strange conclusions. But that was the unanimous decision of the court for varied reasons. Now, back then, and until 1949, although it was a relic of our old status as a colony of the British Empire, there was a further right of appeal from the Supreme Court of Canada, no longer exists, to the House of Lords, what we called the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. So the famous five, as they have come to be known, did not take no for an answer, and they took the case to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, where that final right of appeal existed for all members of the Commonwealth, all countries in the Commonwealth could go to the highest appellate court in the British Empire. And 95 years from this Friday, October 18th, it was specifically October the 18th, 1929, Lord Chancellor Sankey, for a unanimous Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, handed down a decision that women in Canada were indeed and are indeed qualified persons, stating, the word person, as mentioned above, may include members of both sexes, and to those who ask why the word should include females, the obvious answer is, why should it not? Which, of course, was poetry to those who read it and heard it on October 18, 1929. It was reminiscent of another poet, George Bernard Shaw. Now, 7 years earlier, George Bernard Shaw had written in Back to Methuselah, I'm mispronouncing that, Methuselah, Back to Methuselah, George Bernard Shaw in 1922, and he's not cited by the unanimous Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, but he wrote the famous phrase, which has been quoted by many since, there are those that look at things the way they are and ask why, but I dream of things that never were and ask why not. And that was the poetry that I believe inspired the reasoning of a unanimous Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. And 1 year later, as the famous five fought so ardently for, the goal was achieved, and Senator Corrine Wilson was appointed the first female senator in Canadian history. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks today, the Supreme Court of Canada disappointed us all and came to the wrong conclusion in 1928, but the tenacity of the famous five was such that this wrong decision, this historic wrong, was righted. And in the following 95 years in Canada, women have continued to push and lead their government and their country forward, advancing equal rights. Each decade has brought forth another generation of female trailblazers and advocates, from those who fought for the banning of discrimination on the basis of sex within the Canadian Human Rights Act in 1977, to those who demanded equal pay with the Employment Equity Act in 1995, to those in this room who continue to advocate for equal treatment of women at home, at work, and in all aspects of life. As an elected official, I can tell you that the strongest voice for change is the voice of the people, determined to create a better tomorrow for all. In a democracy like ours, the wheels of progress turn forward when people unite in common cause and advocate for shared causes. As incredible as our progress has been since 1929, we all know there is still much more to be done as we strive for true equity between the sexes. Well, we, in the year 2024, have the privilege to look back nearly 100 years and ask, what was that Supreme Court of Canada actually thinking? Let's remember that 100 years from now, Canadians may well look back on us and our generation and wonder the same thing about some of our positions on some issues. So we must always consider our place in the context of history, what our positions will look like 50 or 100 years from now. Do they have associated with them lasting truth and fairness? I'm confident that much like the famous 95 years ago, there will always be good women and good men who will continue to drive our nation forward with dedication to advocating for what is right presently and what can and should remain right for decades and centuries to come. Not only as defined by law, but what is right in the hearts and minds of all people. I have the privilege in my personal and professional life to be surrounded by intelligent and dedicated women in the cabinet, in caucus, and indeed across the aisle. I have the pleasure and privilege of our one and only daughter, Megan, who is a lawyer like myself, my incredible wife of 37 years, Kathy, and I was proud to be guided by the example of my late mother, Mary, and my late grandmothers, Gladys and Frances. And I even was able to know and meet one of my now late great-grandmothers, Elizabeth. She lived long enough to know me as a young lad in the 60s. She had been granted the right to vote over 100 years ago while she was in her early 40s. And she used to tell me about that as a 6-year-old. And she always kept her choice secret because she believed in the secret ballot. I am indeed a better father, husband, and public servant to the people of Ontario because of all of these women. And indeed, I am supported very ably by the wonderful women who are part of my team at the ministry. Without a doubt, our province is stronger because of the contributions women in Ontario and Canada have made throughout our history and continue to make every day. As my colleague in Cabinet and Caucus, the Honourable Charmaine Williams notes, she's our Associate Minister of Women's Social and Economic Opportunity. Minister Williams states often, when women succeed, Ontario succeeds. And so while Persons Day holds great significance for women in Canada, this is truly a day for everyone, all of us, to celebrate, as this landmark decision did indeed open the door for women to claim the right to shape our country for the better. It is an honor to be here alongside all of you today, a momentous day, a momentous celebration. And I want to say in closing that I am certain the remainder of this evening will be both inspiring and informative. I thank Kadie for inviting me to speak this afternoon, as well as Samantha Seabrook, fellow legal counsel, who will provide a much more fulsome keynote on the person's case. Thank you, Samantha. And thank you to Seabrook Workplace Law, Garden of Even, and Lean In Canada for organizing this incredible event, and to all of you for taking the time to attend. And I'd like to acknowledge a young gentleman I just met, but I read his article, Jack Riley. Thank you, Jack, for your excellent essay on the person's case. Well done. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for those heartfelt comments. And I'm sorry you can't join us, but we will send you the live stream. You can watch that on your way to your next event. Take care. So the Minister mentioned trailblazers, and Samantha Seabrook is definitely in that category. When I spoke with her about this event, she just totally lit up and had so much to say that I said, you've got to get on a stage and talk about this. So you heard the name of the Famous Five. You've heard a little bit about the case. She's going to provide the sort of meat around the bones, so you can really understand the impact that it's had in Canada that the minister was alluding to, and in our lives every day, how we feel it. So I'd like to invite Samantha up to the stage. Samantha is the founder of Seabrook Workplace Law, which is actually celebrating 7 years of business this month, so congratulations. Samantha is a Bay Street veteran, and if you're a Bay Street veteran, you know what that means, who started her practice based on the idea of creating good places where good people do good work. She's truly dedicated to helping employers not only face legal challenges, but design an intentional workplace. Seabrook Workplace Law is one of the only law firms that combine legal expertise of lawyers with executive-level HR consultants who bring new and different perspectives to their clients. Samantha is a committed supporter of women in business and the Garden of Even, which I am so grateful for. She's dedicated to ensuring that women achieve full equality, which is what brings her here today and inspired her to participate. Samantha's legal scholarship and studies in history and progressive women make her really the ideal person to bring the Person's Day case to life. And as I said, my mission, and apparently hers too, is to bring this to the place of relevance that it deserves in Canadian history. So I'd like to invite Samantha to come in and give us a fulsome look at that case and its impact.
I'm going to be all technology advanced and use the laptop and not paper. So thank you so much, Kadie, for that warm introduction. And I'm so happy to be here with all of you today to celebrate Person's Day and reflect on this incredible journey that began in 1929 and that continues to shape our lives today. When Kadie came to me and invited me to speak at this event, we've shared so many conversations about the journey of women since the Person's case, where we've been, where we are now, where we hope to go in the future. And Kadie, your leadership for women and for communities, your contributions to making this world a better and kinder place have touched so many people, and so many people that are with us here today in this hall and online. You're such a bold and visionary person. And nowhere is that vision more clear than in the Garden of Even project. I cannot fully express to you what the Garden of Even project has brought to me and has meant to me. For those that haven't had an opportunity to look at the website or to see the art yet or to attend the first event that happened in June of this year, I'm going to explain a little bit. The Garden of Even is a retelling of the stories of historic women through art and new feminist narratives about who they were, what they contributed to the world. The Garden of Even asks a very bold question. What if these women had told their own stories? What if their stories had not been funneled through the machinery of the patriarchy, had not been part of the subjugation of women and the erasure of their contributions to the world? The Garden of Even tells us new stories about so many women that you have heard about all throughout your lives. Jezebel, Tahiri, Mary Magdalene, the Queen of Sheba, and so many others. And Kadie's going to talk to us a little bit later today about Joan of Arc. But for me, out of all of them, the one that touches my own heart the most is the story of Eve. Going all the way back to the beginning, the story of the first woman in the Abrahamic religions. And from the moment that Eve bit into that apple from the forbidden tree of knowledge, humans were cast out of paradise, and women were blamed for the whole lot of human pain and suffering. Eve's story for me is the catalyst of everything that we're going to talk about today, the pernicious narrative throughout history that has kept women from knowledge and from power. But what was Eve's quest for knowledge? What did she want to know? Why did she bite that apple? The Garden of Even website has this to say. For centuries, we have learned and retaught that Eve's hunger for knowledge was shameful, that her selfishness caused the destruction of humanity. And Kadie writes, I see freedom and power in Eve's story. What was she missing? And what did she hope to gain from that infamous bite? I ask, what if Eve had been venerated for seeking knowledge? And this is the power of the Garden of Eden project that Kadie has brought to all of us. The bold retelling of the stories of these historic women. And in this retelling, imagining the world, the society that could have been if women had been equal participants in its creation. And today I want to explore a question that the Garden of Eden project brings so beautifully to life. What if? What if? This question, what if? It's more than just a thought experiment. It's a call to reimagine our world, to challenge the status quo, and to envision a future where women's stories, our voices, and our contributions are fully valued. This simple question, what if? It unlocks the theretofore unimaginable. It creates a path to unlock the unrealized possibilities. And it is the question that led a group of 5 Canadian women to ask, what if women are persons? So let's take a trip back to 1928. The previous decade before 1928 had been monumental for women's rights. During World War I, Canadian women left their traditional roles in the home and turned to working in munitions factories, farming, other production efforts. They took jobs to fill the roles left by men that were fighting in the war. In 1918, the Women's Franchise Act was enacted. The long-fought-for struggle by Canadian suffragists was finally achieved, mostly because in 1917, the mothers and wives of men fighting in the war were allowed to vote. Can't put that cat back in the bag after that. But this act, the Women's Franchise Act, still excluded women from Quebec and Indigenous women from voting. While the role of women underwent great change in the post-World War I period, the social narrative was still one of women as quasi-property, of first their families and then their husbands. Women were seen as of the weaker sex, needing protection from the harsher realities of the world. And it was this narrative that underpinned a lasting interpretation of English common law that was spread throughout the Commonwealth that excluded women from public service, voting, and holding public office. This exclusion was trussed up and presented as a gift to women, as an aid to women, excusing them from the burdens of these responsibilities out of respect for the fairer sex. Thank you so much. The influential case from the United Kingdom of Charlton and Lings, it was a case that, yet again, denied women the right to vote in 1867. But this case is very illustrative of the view of women at this time. Justice Wills said in Charlton and Lings that in this country in modern times, chiefly out of respect to women and a sense of decorum, and not from their want of intellect or their being for any other such reason unfit to take part in the government of the country, they have been excused from taking any share in this Department of Public Affairs. Justice Wills continued to explain that women are under a legal incapacity to vote at elections. What was the cause of it? It's not necessary to go into, he wrote, but admitting that fickleness of judgment and liability to influence have sometimes been suggested as the ground of exclusion. Here comes some fake allyship. He wrote, I must protest against its being supposed to arise in this country from any underrating of the sex, either in point of intellect or worth. That would be quite inconsistent with one of the glories of our civilization, the respect and honor in which women are held. And then to give himself some authority, he said, it's not just my own mere fancy, but that it will be found by other authors in the discussion of the origin of the exclusion of women from judicial and like public functions, where the author gives preference to this reason, that the exemption was founded upon motives of decorum and was a privilege of the sex. Yes, your outrage is correct. Justice Wills concluded this trope by saying and finding that women are persons in matters of pains and penalties, but not rights and privileges. So we could be punished and held accountable under the laws, but women could not have any part in the creation of those laws. This condescending idea about women was applied again and again in the British Commonwealth to keep people from voting and holding public office, but more so to exclude women from the complete realization of their personhood and the complete experience of their humanity. Yet, this exclusion from public life was not universally applied throughout the Commonwealth nor in Canada. While in Upper and Lower Canada, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they upheld the tradition of excluding women for public office, Alberta was, for its time, liberal in the inclusion of women in public offices. And Alberta is where we will find the 5 women who would change the trajectory of the advancement of women in Canada forever. We have Nellie McClung, Canada's first female lawyer. Louise McKinney, she was the first woman elected into the Legislative Assembly of Alberta and the first woman to serve in a legislature in the British Empire. Emily Murphy was a Canadian women's rights activist and author. In 1916, she became the first female magistrate or judge in Canada and the 5th in the British Empire. Mary Irene Parlby was a Canadian women's farm leader, activist, and politician, and she served as an MLA in the Alberta government from 1921 to 1935. And Henrietta Edwards, the namesake of our case, was the co-founder of the National Council of Women of Canada and the Victorian Order of Nurses. The first woman asked to participate in a council to provide the federal government council on policy. This group of women would become known as the Famous Five. And these women were tired of being excluded from further achievements. And on August 27th, 1927, they gathered at Emily Murphy's house in Edmonton. And as some tell the tale, as they were sipping tea on Emily's veranda, they formed a plan to fight the law that was keeping them out of the highest public offices in Canada. So a little constitutional law context. At the time, in 1927, 28, 29, Canada was not a colony of Britain, but it was still within the dominion of the British Empire. And our Constitution at this time was espoused in a document called the British North America Act, which generally left us to govern ourselves, except for matters like foreign policy, and some judicial matters were still retained by the Crown in the United Kingdom. So Section 24 of the British North America Act provided that the government could appoint senators to the Senate of Canada, and the specific language said that the Governor General shall from time to time, in the Queen's name, by instrument under the Great Seal of Canada, summon qualified persons to the Senate. Qualified persons. The Canadian government had consistently interpreted Section 24's reference to persons to refer only to men, relying on the discriminatory view of women espoused in the British case law that I just explained. That it would be indecorous for women to hold public office and an affront to our feminine qualities. It was our privilege to be excluded from these burdens. While sitting on that veranda, tea in hand, the Famous Five set out to change the government's mind. And I like to think of them sitting there asking, what if? What if we fought this? What if we win? What if we are persons? Because I believe that words have power. Words are the literal vibration of our thoughts and feelings. So imagine the psychological impact on not just these 5 very accomplished women, but on all women when they are told again and again that they are not a person. A person, this word in its simple definition means a human being regarded as an individual. A human being. An individual. And this is what the Canadian government was telling women, that you're not a human being or an individual under our laws. And imagine the impact on the spirit of women, that due to their gender and gender alone, that they were disqualified from the definition of person. So returning to our heroines in Alberta, what did they do? So at the time, there was a little-known provision in the Supreme Court of Canada Act that allowed any 5 persons acting as a unit to petition the government to refer a reference to the Supreme Court of Canada for an interpretation of any part of the Constitution. And that's exactly what the famous 5 did. They petitioned the government of William Lyon Mackenzie to answer the question whether the term persons in Section 24 of the British North America Act included women. To which Mr. Lyon Mackenzie responded resoundingly, it did not. And the case was sent to the Supreme Court of Canada, where unanimously the judges of the court also said no, women were not persons under Section 24 of the British North America Act. Then Justice Anglin applied the precedent in Charlton and Lings that I discussed earlier, upholding these centuries of subjugation and discrimination against women. British Columbia's Ellen Smith, who was the first female cabinet minister and female speaker of the legislature in the British Empire, reacted to this news by saying, "The iron dropped into the souls of women in Canada when we heard that it took a man to decree that his mother was not a person." Oh God, I love how they talked back then. The iron dropped into the souls of women, and certainly indeed it did, because undeterred, the famous 5 had one more chance. As Canada was at that time still part of the British Empire, the final level of appeal was to the Privy Council in the United Kingdom. And in the Privy Council, we find our ally, Lord Sankey, who wrote, "The word person, as above mentioned, may include members of both sexes, and to those who ask why the word should include females, the obvious answer is, why should it not?" And Lord Sankey took things one step further, saying that the exclusion of women from all public offices is a relic of days more barbarous than ours. And with that, women were declared persons, human beings and individuals. Because this decision was not just about eligibility for the Senate, because, probably doesn't matter that much to most people, but it was a statement that women had a rightful place, that they had something to contribute to this society, to public life. And imagine the validation and the relief, the pride that the famous 5 felt when they finally were declared persons. Member of the famous 5 and namesake of the case, Henrietta Edwards, said in response to the judgment, "This decision marks the abolition of sex in politics." Oh, Henrietta, if only it were true. In so many ways. She continued, she said, "Personally, I don't care whether or not women ever sit in the Senate, but we fought for the privilege for them to do so. And we have sought to establish the personal individuality of women, and this decision is the announcement of our victory." And this decision had reverberations throughout the British Empire because it clearly asserted that anti-suffragists could no longer suppress women's rights through clever legal arguments and prejudiced traditions. Also, many other countries in the Commonwealth adopted the new definition of persons as always meaning both women and men. Unfortunately, none of the famous 5 were ever appointed to the Senate due to a trick of our Constitution that requires senators be appointed based on region, and then, of course, based on the political party of the one appointing them. But the honor of being the first woman senator went to Corrine Wilson from Ontario, who was appointed 4 months after Lord Sankey's decision was issued. I think it's important, though, while we're celebrating this victory of the person's case, that the person's case extended personhood to some Canadian women, not all of them. We can't forget that the famous 5, these women, they were all products of their time, all white Christian women, with some holding ideas that should never have been acceptable and are certainly not acceptable now. It's true that many held racist and elitist ideas, writing and speaking on abhorrent topics like eugenics. So while the person's case was a victory for some Canadian women, it was not meant at that time to apply to all Canadian women. and we must never forget and remember the continuing struggles of Indigenous women and women of color in this country. Yet the person's case gave us another gift, one that would allow our society, our laws, our rights to grow and change, to become more inclusive with time, and to protect more people. Because the person's case gave Canada this second important constitutional moment, the creation of the living tree doctrine. And my fellow lawyers in the audience will know what I'm talking about. As we saw in the person's case, right, our Supreme Court looked backwards and applied a traditional view of women and their place in society that no longer reflected the social change that had occurred during World War I. Lord Sankey changed this looking backwards. Lord Sankey wrote in the person's case that the British North America Act planted in Canada a living tree capable of growth and expansion within its natural limits. And this is what became known as the Living Tree Doctrine, a progressive interpretation doctrine of our Constitution. I'm going to condense, some decades of constitutional law, but basically the Living Tree Doctrine means that Canada's Constitution, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms now, is to be interpreted in a large and liberal manner within natural limits to reflect the society of the day. This doctrine has given Canada a mechanism to allow our Constitution and our Charter case law to grow and change as our society has grown and changed. It's given us an expansion of our rights and freedoms reflective of a society that has grown more diverse, more open, and more accepting of all of the people in this country. The Living Tree Doctrine and the progressive interpretation of our Constitution and Charter of Rights and Freedoms has been applied in this country to make same-sex marriage legal, expand and protect Indigenous rights, provide and protect abortion rights, erase criminal sanctions against sex workers, and expand protections on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. So the fight of these 5 women in Alberta, their fight to become persons under our laws, introduced a doctrine of constitutional interpretation that still allows our country, our laws, our rights to grow and change with our society as we continue to grow and change. The person's case was a turning point, but it was only a beginning. Since that day, women continue to ask, what if, and push the boundaries of what is possible. Because we all know and have experienced, everyone in this room, the person's case did not magically change things and we all became very equal and had an equal part in everything. No, the 9 decades that have passed since 1929 to today have been a frustratingly slow process of women's inclusion in all aspects of Canadian society. Education, work, business, wealth, politics, 9 decades later, and we're still not at full inclusion. Heck, we still can't even get equal pay. Katie's hard at work at that. Thank you so much. Yet today, we have more women leading companies, founding startups, shaping politics and leadership than ever before. And yet there's still a gap, one that speaks to representation and the balance of power. Women are often juggling multiple roles, executives by day, caregivers by night. The pandemic showed us that women, especially mothers, disproportionately carry the burden of unpaid care work, and that women make up a large portion of those in precarious work in sectors that are underpaid and undervalued. And while we celebrate trailblazers who have shattered glass ceilings, there are still many women facing barriers, particularly those from intersectional, marginalized communities. There are still too many of us facing violence, because I say we cannot have true equality of all Canadian women until Canadian Indigenous women are equal, and Indigenous women cannot be equal while Indigenous women are still missing and being murdered in this country. And while we sit at the precipice of the greatest social change for the advancement of women yet, there are still too many things left undone. And now we live with the specter of what is happening in the United States, with the overt backlash against women, the easiness with which gendered insults are hurled by the Republican candidates. Because I see you out there, my fellow childless cat ladies, I see you. And while we laugh, because it's weird, while we laugh, it still hurts. It still hurts because underneath it all, we know it comes from a place of not being truly valued and not being truly included, that we are different and we are seen as less by too many people. Yes, we still face barriers, and yes, we still face violence, and yes, we still do not have full equality and inclusion. But I tell you right now that I am so happy to have been born as a woman in this lifetime and be part of this moment in history with all of you as a woman. Because now we get to ask new what ifs. We are moving from asking to have a seat at a table that was never built for us, that has actively tried to exclude us. Now we get to ask new questions. We get to ask, what if we rebuilt the table? We live, go to work, build businesses, contribute overwhelmingly to an economy that was not built to consider the life experiences of women. Think about it. We go to school, we go to college, university, when we're at our most fertile, and many of us may want to have families. And then we enter our highest earning years when we enter menopause, and everything just goes a little weird. So our entire work and economic realities do not account for the real physical, biological life experiences of women. So let's ask, what if work and economy reflected women's life cycle? Decades of studies show women leaders help increase productivity, enhance collaboration, inspire organizational dedication, and improve fairness. Yet there's a persistent continuation and admiration of old leadership styles of dominance, hierarchy, and exclusion. So let's ask, what if? What if we change society's view of what is good leadership? Who is a good leader? Majority-owned women businesses only accounted for 19.6% of all private sector businesses in Canada at the start of 2024. We are 51% of this population. And yet, are we surprised? Because this is a reflection of the amount of VC funding that goes to women-owned businesses. In 2022, only 12% of VC funding went to companies with at least one woman founder. So let's ask, what if? What if women received the equal funding, mentorship, and support for their businesses in this country? What if? We're at such an important historical moment for women, where we've never had this much economic and political power. And I tell you, I am praying to all the gods and goddesses that will listen that Kamala Harris becomes the next president of the United States of America. Because as more women gain power and a place at the table, we have to ask, we must ask new what-if questions so we can uplift even more women. So I propose to you that the question for our time, the question for this moment in history, is what if the world was intentionally designed to uplift and empower women? What if? Please take this question home with you. Ask, what would this world look like? And then take your ideas and put them into action. So, before Kadie and I continue to discuss exactly this question, I want to thank you so much for being here with us and supporting this event. This year is a celebration of 95 years since the Person's case was decided. And I plan to be here every year, and I plan to be here in 5 years to celebrate 100 years of the Person's case. So I hope you all are going to join us for these great celebrations in the future. Thank you. Okay, good. Okay, Kadie, go ahead and book the hall. It'll be good. Okay. I want to do some quick thank yous. Well, she's not here in the hall. I know she's watching online. Marianne McConkey. Marianne is the godmother of labor relations and pay equity at the University of Toronto, back when this was all first getting started. Marianne, I'm so happy to have your mentorship and your friendship. I also want to thank Orchid Shahi, who's here right in front of me. Orchid, you've created such a wonderful collective of women. You're the best supporter of women in business. Thank you again so much for your friendship, your kindness, your advice, and your time. My Verity sisters that are out there, thank you, thank you, thank you. My business partner, Ted Panagiotulias, thank you so much for coming on crazy adventures with me and trusting me. And our colleague, Elena Kaminsky, who did so much of the research that you all saw in the wonderful posts that were going on social media about the history of women in Canada. And last, my mom. She traveled here to be with me today, and I just want to say thank you for always being an example of strength and just getting things done with grit and determination. I love you. Thank you.
Let's grab a seat. Let's have a seat and talk a bit more. Thank you. That was amazing. And I think the best part about the person's case is it's so personal. Like, we all experience or don't experience in some way our own personhood, depending on what's around us. I love the point you made about, like, now it's never been a better time to be born a woman. We know it's not perfect, because I think in some ways we don't assert our personhood. Like, the culture tells us how to behave, and then we suffer for it because we don't really step into our own personhood.
To have it all, you mean?
To have it all, maybe that's part of it. But maybe, like, tell us a bit more about, like, how do you see that manifested in the workplaces or with women where they're not actually really asserting their own personhood?
Well, it's interesting because I think there is more of an assertion of personhood that's happening now, and it's an interesting tension that's happening where, you know, I'm an employment lawyer. We do a lot of workplace investigations in my firm. So we're seeing a shift in the bases for complaints, that it's not so much very overt sexist behavior, sexual harassment. It's changed to more of a discussion about the way that men are acting in a meeting, the way that they're talking to me, the feedback that I'm getting. It's not right. The tone and the tenor of this is not right. And and we can talk about the law, but I sense that this is coming from an assertion of the way women communicate and asking that that is the way that they are communicated to in the workplace. That it's no longer acceptable to be subjected to forms of communication that are more aggressive, that are not in keeping with how women communicate amongst ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, and I don't want to get too, like, biological determinists here, but there's different forms of communication, and the way I think
it's socialization.
And socialization, and I think there's a lot of data that we won't get into the data because we've had a lot of stats pulled at us today, but there's a lot of socialization that sort of forms the way that our expectations for communication, and there's people in HR here that know those patterns. You asked the question, what if we rebuild the table? And this is like, you know, because we often hear, well, if there's not
Tear
a
it all
seat,
down.
if there's not a seat for you at the table, pull one up. Like, what if we just tear it down and start over? So what if we rebuild the table?
Exactly. You know, you've all sat at tables with chairs that are too high and your feet are kicking and you're like, who sits here? It's not built for me. I have a funny story. Like, one time when I was working on Bay Street, like, you know, when you have to swipe your card to get into the hallway, into the actual office space, I was coming in with, like, my purse, my rolling bag, a coffee, my lunch, and I get to the door and I'm like, oh, my swipe card is in the bottom of my purse. And there's no place to set everything down and dig for it, and I'm trying to figure out what to do. And the elevator doors open, and off strides, like, one of the senior male partners who, without a care in the world, comes up to the door, opens his jacket, reaches into his jacket pocket, because pockets, and swipes the door and opens it for me. And I'm like, this world was not made for my experience. Like, how simple would it be to imagine a world where there is a table beside the door to put your purse on to dig for your stuff? This is women's experience. And I know this is a kind of banal example, but it's illustrative of, how are we designing things? How are we thinking about systems? Are we thinking about it from the perspective of women that we all carry purses? Why don't we have a place to put it down? Yeah. But going back more importantly to what we should be talking about, not my purse. What I consider a lot is the state of leadership, the qualities of leadership that is changing. I mentioned a little bit in my speech about what happens when women achieve these places of leadership. And yes, some statistics show us that women have made great advancements at the executive level. I have to question, though, where are those positions? Where are women being placed in those executive levels? Because there's a difference, and all of you that are on executive teams know, there's a difference when you're on the staffing side or on the revenue generating side of the table. And women are more being put into in-house legal counsel roles, your VP of HR, Chief Human Resources Officer, which are amazing and important roles, but when it comes down to it, the people that have more power are the people making the money. And so until we start seeing more women in chief product roles, CIO roles, these kinds of roles, that's when we're going to see more of a shift.
Yes, and also different conversation until we start valuing those roles appropriately also.
Also that, because...
Maybe they're devalued because they're traditionally done by women. It's a different conversation.
Yes.
But it's...
but I think a very good one to have.
It is a relevant conversation for this. So what do you see, this whole process of people's expectations are changing, women, maybe even men or the next generation coming up, they're just not putting up with this or saying, communicate with me the way I want to be communicated, respect my personhood. What do you see employers doing to address this? Because you're on the ground, you see that there's a shift in the labor market expectations, and women and all persons stepping into more of their rights. What do you see happening in the trends? Or maybe not trends, best practices, what are employers doing?
Well, I think it's a very interesting point in time right now for that discussion, because let's take something that has overwhelmingly benefited women, work from home. Work from home has overwhelmingly benefited women because they still carry the burden of caregiving roles, whether for children or for aging parents. And we're seeing a movement away from work from home. We also saw Amazon is going to have people go back 5 days a week starting in 2025. PwC is going to start tracking where their people are and where they're working. And listen, maybe that's working for their businesses, but the impact that that's having on women has to be talked about. In my view, maybe it's a very good time to recruit some women from these companies that are moving to 5 days in the office if you are looking for some good talent at a good price. That's my thought process of it. Everything will even out. People will land where they need to land, but there's a bigger conversation. And while policies like work from home have a direct measurable impact on women, obviously they do on men as well. We're talking about people's lives, the precious hours of their day that are going to sitting in a car on the TTC that could be spent with families, with communities, volunteering, that we're taking away from people.
Yeah, it's much bigger than just the gendered aspect. It's moving into a more values-based look and what people actually value. I would love to get some more employer perspective on this, so I'm going to invite up two more voices, Erin Adams and Juliet Turpin. Erin Adams is the VP of Human Resources with the Globe and Mail, and she has a diverse background in human resources with experience at the Globe and Mail, the Dominion of Canada General Insurance Company, and North York General Hospital. Erin has an MBA from the University of Toronto, Rotman School of Management, and a BCom from Queen's University. She's held various titles like AVP of Corporate Projects, AVP of HR, and Manager of HR Services. So Erin, I'd love to hear your perspective. Juliet is the VP of Lean in Canada. That's who she's representing tonight, one of our partners. She's on is dedicated to the mission of creating more equitable opportunities in the world of work. And to support this endeavor, Juliet is proud to be accredited in both Canada and the US as a certified Canadian inclusion professional and certified diversity executive. Juliet has over 30 years of experience partnering with hundreds of organizations across Canada, developing workforce management and talent acquisition strategies. She also has led over 5 years of experience leading diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, both internally and externally as a DE&I consultant. And with this unique perspective, Juliet strives to create tangible pathways to more sustainable, diverse, and equitable world, especially in the world of work. So we'd love to hear more on how this is translating into the world of work. So come on up. Get you to take the chair.
I'm glad they told us to wear pants.
I agree. Yes, or a longer dress.
Not the most flattering angle for a woman of my age, but that's all.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really so excited to be talking to the both of you that have done so much and have such progressive workplaces to talk about and the work that you're doing. So let's jump into it. Erin, I'm going to start with you because you work in media. And media is historically and infamously a difficult place for women to work. But the Globe and Mail in the last several years has really made a decisive and intentional effort to be more supportive of women and really all persons in the workplace. I don't want to forget anybody because the Globe and Mail, you've partnered with organizations like Indigenous Works, Pride at Work, the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, and you are a signatory of the Black North Initiative. So tell us the story. How did this come to be at the Globe and Mail, and tell us some more specifics about what you're doing.
Sure. So hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. So the Globe has been on a long journey, and it's true, media traditionally has been a very difficult workplace for women, but certainly have made great strides. So right now, our newsroom is about 50% identify as women, which is wonderful, and about 50% of our executive team are women. And to the comments earlier, a lot of us are in staffing roles, but we do have a few women that are more on the business side, and hopefully that will increase. And so what we're focused on now is continuing to make sure that women continue to progress, but also on other diversity aspects, and hence partnering with Indigenous Works, being a signatory of Black North Initiative. Those are all really important to us and areas that we do need to continue to improve. Those are definitely areas that we need to continue to improve. But what we're focused on is continuing to look at the workplace and making sure that people are comfortable bringing their whole selves to work. And so, probably traditionally when people, when there were more women in the newsroom, you probably had to be very careful about what you shared. Your personal life was probably very different than your business life. And so what we're trying to do is to bring more policies to life that recognize that there is a personal life and there's a work life, and they're not necessarily separate. So encouraging people to bring their full selves to work. And so when I say the word policy, we use that word quite broadly. So a lot of people might think of them more as guidelines, but we've introduced a number of policies, and they're trying to educate people about issues, trying to reduce the stigma around talking about issues, and trying to make it a more of a safe spot where you can feel comfortable to talk to your manager, your colleagues, that type of thing. And also making sure that we make it very clear that there's zero tolerance for harassment or discrimination or anything. And so examples of those policies would be, we introduced a menopause policy almost a year ago, so last November. Yay. We have a domestic and intimate partner violence policy that we introduced, a transitioning at work policy, and we've revamped our pregnancy and parental leave and have a guide now to help people come back to work. So I can talk a little bit about couple of those if you want.
That would be amazing. Tell us more. This all sounds great.
So the menopause policy, I realize I come from a position of privilege being in HR, so I get to kind of hear people's stories, and I'm often at the table when we're talking about performance issues or things like that. And so over the years, I've heard so often that there was, this superstar, high performer, all of a sudden has become really disengaged and, doesn't seem like she's kind of checked out, doesn't seem to be so interested, not coming to work as regularly. And I know, because I've talked to the woman, that she's dealing with menopausal symptoms that are impacting her at work. And so I'm able to bring a different lens to that conversation, that it's not that she's checked out and it's not that she's disengaged, that there's other things going on in her life. And so then I realized, but so many women are not comfortable talking to their managers at all. And so they will suffer in silence. And so the menopause policy, when we introduced it, was really meant to educate managers and colleagues about the symptoms of menopause and how they show up at work. And try and reduce the stigma. Like, let's talk about it. It's fine. And in HR, I'm surrounded by a bunch of other women that are kind of my age, and so we all, we can be very open with what we're dealing with. But if I were to work in a department where it was 90% men, I probably, no offense to, the men, I probably wouldn't be as comfortable. And so that policy then is, some of the symptoms that women experience, how that can show up at work, and then the adjustments that you can make to try and help kind of minimize the impact at work. And so that's one example for our menopause policy.
And what are some of the adjustments that the policy recommends?
So one of them is actually allowing people to work from home more often. Because there are legitimate reasons why a woman might not be able to leave her house for a period of time. And so it could be allowing them to have breaks, having ability to go and get water whenever they need it, going to sit in our wellness area where there's fans, things like that. It's not earth-shattering. Changing hours of work. Maybe they want to work earlier, or they want to work later, or they want a condensed time in the office, then they can work from home. Lots of things that you would do for other medical reasons.
And not super expensive.
And not expensive, right? Not expensive. So, yeah. And do you want me to talk about some of the other policies?
Yes,
or?
please,
Okay.
yeah.
So the domestic violence policy, so how that came up was the Globe and Mail has a podcast, and this is my little plug, but it's called In Her Defense, and I'm not sure whether anyone's listened to it or not. I highly recommend it.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. So the first season came out last year, and it was about a woman in Alberta who was in an abusive relationship for almost 30 years, and so her husband was mentally, physically, emotionally, psychologically abusive to her and her 3 sons. She killed him, and they hid the body, and then eventually they found out that it was her, and she was charged to something like 18 years in prison, which is, anyway, in my non-legal opinion, after being exposed to that type of violence, seems quite extreme. So as I was listening to it, and they were interviewing her family, her friends, and I was amazed with how many other women were dealing with domestic violence. And these are your average average Canadians. And it just struck me how common it must be. And so we thought, okay, well, let's do this domestic violence policy, because we do have a violence in the workplace policy, but it really talks about how do you keep people safe if the domestic violence comes to the workplace. It doesn't talk about how do you support the person out, away from the workplace. And so the domestic violence policy really is, again, let's educate people about what it is. Let's talk about how it could manifest itself at work. Let's reduce the stigma so that women or men, whoever are the victims, because I do recognize that there are men that are victims of domestic violence as well, though the vast majority are women. So let's reduce the stigma so that people can talk about it, whether it's to their manager, to their colleagues, to HR, and let's think of ways that steps that we can take to try and protect women when they're in the workplace. And so then we launched that policy just earlier this year.
Well, it's really amazing that the Globe and Mail is so open to just, hey, we did a podcast about this issue, and allowing you the latitude and the freedom to introduce a new way of thinking because of the reporting that's going on at the Globe and Mail. That's awesome. Can we talk a little bit about the transitioning at work policy? Because I don't think that's something that we're seeing happen in most workplaces.
Sure. So we have employee resource groups, which I'm sure some of the or bigger companies do. So one of our employee resource groups is Pride at the Globe, and that's for our LGBT employees and their allies. And so they raised, and we were also thinking about it, is that when we have an employee that is transitioning at work, again, we don't really have anything in place for managers or colleagues to support that employee. And so how do we make sure, I'm going to sound like a broken record, how do we make sure that we educate people, that we make it a safe spot, a safe space, so that if people want to transition at work, that they're comfortable to do it? And so the policy provides kind of a guideline, how to have the conversation, the questions to ask, and then for both the manager and the employee, things to think about, like how do you want your transition to work, and then how can we support you with that. And so our ERG was a very important part. They reviewed it, they provided feedback, and then we were able to launch the policy. And it works out really nicely because the Pride at the Globe has a nonprofit that they support, and it's called it's a nonprofit organization called Friends of Ruby. And so they are in our kind of neighborhood of where the Globe is, and that's our charity of choice. And so they support LGBT youth in our area. So it was kind of a nice tie-in with them as well.
Well, that's so amazing to hear. So it's just us HR people talking. When new policies are introduced in workplaces and things that push people to think in a different way, there can be sometimes some resistance by certain segments of the work population. How was the experience of rolling out policies that are quite progressive, that are quite new in a Canadian workplace? How were they received?
Yeah, so I'll use the example of the menopause policy. So usually when I send out a new policy, I press send, and it's crickets. I'm pretty sure nobody's ever read my policies. Nobody is interested in my policies. But when I kind of sent out that menopause policy, we had such a good response. Like, women were so happy that we did that. And so I was trying to think of how do I share that at the executive committee? Because I don't want to kind of self-promote. Anyways, it worked out so perfectly. So unrehearsed, I was walking to one of our executive meetings with one of my male colleagues, and we were walking through editorial, and there were about 5 women in the kitchen area, and there's Erin, call her over. So we went over, and they were just raving about the policy and how they felt like the Globe was such a progressive employer. They really appreciated that the Globe actually has a policy that then encourages them to talk. And so it was perfect. They were just so positive about it. And then we went to the executive meeting, and we were sitting down, and my colleague who was with me said, "Did you know that Erin's kind of a celebrity now?" And anyway, so it was a perfect opening because, I could have said it, but for him to have witnessed it and for him to share it at the executive committee was really, I think, very powerful. So it really reinforced, I think, the importance of those types of policies to the executive team, how important those are to our staff.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Juliet, let's bring you into the discussion, because you've had such a rich career in cultivating new paths for women and supporting women in business and at work through talent recruitment on that side of HR. And now you're with Lean in Canada, and you're focusing on supporting women at work with 8,500 members across Canada now. That's amazing. So what has been the greatest impact? What has brought the most impact to your membership across Canada?
Well, so first of all, Well, part of the reason why I joined Lean In is because I really saw the diversity of the group and the membership. I loved that there was individuals that were coming basically from all walks of life, all ages, all different workplaces, including working at home. And just loved the diversity of it. So that's what initially brought me there. And to see the group that's gathered here, it's an example of where individuals want to come forward and create a world that is created by us and for us. So the impact that we recently ran a membership survey, and what our members told us was most impactful for them was basically three things. The first was what we call our circles, and circles are basically little communities, small group communities where women convene and talk about whatever the topic might be. And we now worldwide have over 100,000 circles. And we are in over 184 countries, and I think the UN says there's about 195. So if you think about that, the power of that network is absolutely incredible. And what we found is that 4.5 out of 5 women that are in these groups say that they walk out with an increased sense of confidence. So that confidence is so important because as we look at the world today, we are, especially North America, we've come to a place where we now have more safe spaces. We now need to convert these safe spaces into brave spaces, where women will stand in their power and have these circles and areas of life to be able to practice, take theory and move it into practice and activate. So that's what those circles do. The second one is basically our networks, which are basically just several circles working together to create events like this one. And in those events, we have received resounding feedback that once again, it's an opportunity to gain lived experience in listening and speaking up, and again, activating, which is another key piece. And then the third point that our members have said that they found very valuable is our resources. So I'm super impressed with the free resources that we provide. Many of them are very data-driven, which, as we all know, within our organization, there's a constant ask for data. And so they're very data-driven, from our 10th year anniversary for our joint report with McKinsey, and as well as specifically in Ontario, in 2021, we released a pay equity report for women of color, actually led by one of our previous presidents who's here right now, Angela Payne. And as well, we also have free slide decks that are copious. They're about 100 slides long, but they give individuals an opportunity to be able to move those conversations into their organizations, into their communities, and basically empower them, almost like a train the trainer type moment, and take that on to be able to again activate within their communities. So basically it's those three pieces that seem to create the magic that our membership enjoy.
That sounds so incredible. Can you tell us a little bit more about the activations you were talking about, like the things that are decided in the circles that are meant to be brought forward and activated? That just sounds such a powerful support system.
Yes, so in each of the circles, one of the key pieces that we ask each of the circle leaders to engage in is to ask their membership to make at least one commitment before they leave their circle. So circles can run anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. And they can have different topics, but we ask for one activation. So if you imagine those 100,000 circles and the one action by those individual women in those circles, there's a lot of action that's happening there, right? And a lot of opportunity and a brave space to practice those activations with your fellow women as well as within the organizations that they work. And actually, one of the pieces of key pieces of these slide decks and these circle conversations is allyship, which is critical. It's actually one of the recommendations that we make in our report to businesses we really need to get more strong with activating allies. And specifically in our managers within our working organizations, and then our majority groups, which is our white men, rather than, and being very careful about including them and intentionally including them to become allies.
Allyship is so important. We had Lord Sankey back in 1929. We need more. Right? We need more people. And so you mentioned your partnership with McKinsey and the Women in the Workplace, a study that comes out every year. This year is 10 years. I love reading it. Can you share with us some of the insights that are coming out of this report this year after 10 years of data?
Yeah. So there's a lot of actually good news that sits in there. It was funny when I was sitting there and I was listening to you and Kadie and hearing, okay, we need to talk about the celebrations and all the good stuff. And I thought, oh, did I focus in on the celebration? So there's a lot of really good things, as well as a lot of opportunities, obviously, for further movement. But what we found, some of the key highlights are that we're actually seeing more women present at all levels of organizations in North America. So that's a really good news story. We're also seeing that there's a lot more conversation. I think that you had mentioned this, that the business case for diversity is dead. Like, everyone knows it's one. We get it. Now the question is the activation piece, but at least now companies are more afraid to say they don't have a business case for diversity. So that's another good piece. And at this end, we also have more women, obviously, in C-suite positions than we've ever had in North America, which is great, at approximately 26%, I think. So those are also great news and bright spot stories.
That sounds good to me. I'm glad that that's where the data is trending after 10 years. What great work to bring it year after year so that we can have real, tangible data about what is happening for women at work. So there's been 10 years of data. I've asked a big question about what ifs. So I would like to ask both of you, what's next? What do you see as the next best practice, the next thing that we can take from here and implement in our businesses or ask for it in our workplaces?
So if I look at, from an HR perspective, I think we'll continue to see workplaces that are focused on the whole person. So the fact that there's not kind of a clean line between your work life and your personal life, I think we will continue to see kind of policies and hopefully practices and work environments that celebrate the whole person. And so, and allow people to bring their whole selves to work. I think if people are comfortable bringing their whole selves to work, it benefits the person, but it also benefits the company. You're more engaged, you're more productive. That's good for the person, but it's also good for the company. So I do think as we look forward, I'm hoping you'll continue to see more companies introducing policies that are not necessarily just dealing with kind of productivity or work or just, as I say, more kind of the whole selves, and recognizing, I think it's really important to recognize that sometimes your personal life takes precedent and sometimes your work life needs to take precedent, and it's a bit of a, kind of a give and take. And I think employers need to recognize that give and take. Sometimes people need to work longer hours, sometimes people might need to work shorter hours because of what's going on. And I think it's important that that we recognize that and we allow people to feel comfortable talking about that at work.
Being a person. Imagine being a person.
Imagine, yeah. So there's three recommendations that we have in the report. The first one is the pipeline. So currently, our pipelines of diversity into leadership, and specifically in this case, women, it's struggling. So there's a lot of broken rungs, especially in the North American workspace. And the rungs get broken for different for ethnicities and underrepresented women groups. So, for example, for Asian women, that rung seems to be broken at the SVP level. For Latina women, it seems to be broken at the frontline manager level. And for Black women at the entry level. And so it's knowing and knowing your data and taking a look at that and then identifying your own broken rungs. And a lot of organizations right now, we've done a lot of good work at the hiring stage. It's the promotion stage, right? We spoke about this earlier, that there are less organizations right now that see DEI as a priority, and we actually saw a 10% drop over 5 years since the murder of George Floyd in regards to organizations that say DEI is a priority, and specifically that racial diversity is a priority. So these are things that we need to be aware of and then take a look at those broken rungs, because they're creating what we call sticky floors and leaky pipes that is eroding some of the really great work that we're doing. And then the other two the suggestions are that we need to activate our allyship within our male leaders specifically and our managers. And then lastly, that we need to take a look at bringing women to the table. So again, it's creating those, not only those safe spaces, but now those brave spaces, and creating a world that's not just made by others and inviting them to, kind of just confer. So I'll give you an example. There's a saying that diversity, I think many of us have heard this, diversity is like being invited to the party. Inclusion is like being invited to dance. And one of the things that I like to say is that belonging, true belonging, is actually being invited to the planning of that dang party. So you pick the playlist, right?
Yes.
So those are basically the recommendations that we have. And for me specifically, I would say that we just need to be more strategic when we think about diversity and inclusion and the power that sits behind diversity and inclusion to really move initiatives. The world in general, we have some really big problems, and the world of work has some really big problems. We need all the minds at the table to figure out these problems, and we need that diversity with all those minds, because the ones that we have right now have gotten us this far, but they're not potentially going to get us where we need to go.
That is such good data, so many good points. Thank you so much. And if you haven't read the report from McKinsey and Lean in Canada, it's available online. It is amazing information about the state of women at work. Go read it every year, but this year in particular, 10 years of data. Erin, Juliet, I wish we had like 2 more hours to talk. You bring such amazing and unique perspectives. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And now we're going to invite Laura Williams to come up and speak and introduce the next part of our program for this evening.
Can't hear? Okay, is that better? Yes. Okay, I feel like Forrest Gump, and that's all I've got to say about that. What I was saying is there's so much to celebrate, and this event in and of itself does give us a lot to celebrate. And, you know, just this discussion was so powerful with all of the insights and the different inspiration that certainly I got as a managing partner of a labor and employment law firm as well. And I'll tell you, I've been doing this for 30 years. And the joke I said when the mic wasn't on is that I try to pass myself off as a natural redhead. I'm actually a silver fox. And I have not heard, I will tell you, of a menopause policy. Like, this is stuff that is cutting edge, progressive, empowering. What I have heard of is women taking a mental health day due to menopause symptoms, and that's just not right. You know, as well, hearing from Juliet about, you know, the data. I mean, this whole concept of really studying the data behind kind of broken runs, that's powerful because we are empowered once we understand how marginalized groups and also intersectional women get blocked at certain stages of progression within their careers. So this was just an outstanding discussion. And also, Juliet, with respect to your reference to what Lean In Canada has done to inspire women globally from a confidence perspective, confidence is everything. Because confidence is what gives us the voice to speak, and it also gives us the wind in our sails to make the change that needs to happen. So with that, I want to invite Kadie up to give our closing keynote. And I do have a word to say about Kadie before I give the official kind of intro about Kadie. So I met Kadie when I was moderating a panel of 3 women, and it was on kind of equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. And at one point, our eyes locked, and I said, I dig this chick. I gotta tell you, like, straight up, that's exactly what came in my mind. It was, I saw the depth, the integrity, the desire to make change and to make significant change for women. And then I got to know a little bit more about Kadie, and she definitely walks her talk. So when I had more time to really, as my sons would say to me, to really deep what she was all about, you know, just if you take in the fact that Kadie, as a seasoned executive, has work that's been categorized by collaboration across public, private, and non-government organizations. Her work in over 100 cities from 30 countries, all going through seismic social, political, or economic transition, has taught her the transformative power of storytelling. And storytelling she does brilliantly. And the other piece about Kadie that's so true is just she understands what we have to understand more, and that is the transformative power of truth. In June, Kadie launched The Garden of Even as a platform to share unknown truths about women we think we know well, and some we should know better, so we can recognize and claim their power and contributions. So today, Kadie's going to share with us Joan of Arc's story, but in a way you've likely never heard it, and she's going to show us how Joan's journey to personhood can definitely serve us today. So with that, let's welcome Kadie to the stage.
Thank you. So following the Battle of Orleans, where Joan led the French army in a decisive victory over the English, the Dauphin, or Prince, was crowned king at Rheims, where Joan stood proudly, there's Joan, proudly by his side. When asked later by her trial inquisitors, why was your flag carried in the church more than any other captain's, she answered simply, as it had borne the burden, it was quite right that it received the honor. I spent the summer getting to know and falling in love with Joan in preparation for this keynote, and I was sitting at a cottage reading her trial notes, just sort of half distracted by, the wind in the trees and the water lapping the shore, when that line silenced the world around me. She essentially says to her accusers, Because I did the work, I am worthy of the recognition, the reward. Now imagine the audacity of a girl in medieval France where women did not claim agency or any type of authority. And yet, there is Joan, who had done the work and claimed her worth. Now imagine where we would be if this one lesson had been learned and celebrated from Joan of Arc. Worth is unapologetically claimed. Joan was born a peasant girl in 1412 on a small farm in a rural village on the eastern frontier of the Kingdom of France. She was born into a hyper-patriarchal society based on class and power. Children and women really did not exist outside their fathers' or their husbands' homes. Now, this was a society fine-tuned in layers and layers of hierarchy, and wherever you were determined how many people were above you and who could essentially make your life miserable, so sort of like today's organizational charts. Now, there is more written about Joan in history than most people, and yet she remains so enigmatic because it's not the what that is mysterious, it's the how. Because on the surface, there should have been no chance whatsoever that a young peasant girl, dressed as a man, could lead an army with such precision that she would turn the 100 Years' War in France's favor and ultimate victory over England. She belonged to the wrong gender, the wrong social class, and the wrong age to achieve what she dreamed of. And yet she did. How she did it is a story filled with vision, courage, and betrayal, which spanned more than a half a century and another 600 years for her to be canonized and reconciled from heretic and witch to blessed, venerated, and finally saint. Now, that's a long time to wait for reconciliation. But what if we were to tell the truth of women's stories and claim the power and pathway that Joan and other women have opened for us? I believe we could build upon their powerful contributions and apply their principles of transformation now and in the future so we could access the full spectrum of human potential and each of us step into our own radical personhood. I think we would all agree that Joan's story is a radical hero story, one where she goes outside into the world and also inside into herself to become the person she was meant to be. So let's talk about how she found the courage to step into her own radical personhood. Now, Joan had a fairly common peasant upbringing, learning to spin wool with her mother, minding the flock with her father, and enjoying the lush pastures with her brothers and sister. What was uncommon was Joan's extremely high intelligence, which manifested itself at a very early age. Now, books or teachers were required for literacy, and Joan had access to neither. So her talent came out of her instinctive perception of the world around her. Late in childhood, with the dangerous conflict swirling around her, Joan began to develop a deep sense of spirituality through her Catholic faith. Simply, she just found comfort in meditation, prayer, and reflection. When she was 13, she claimed the Archangel Michael appeared to her and told her that no knight, nor king, nor general could save France. No one except her. From her own testimony, she says, "The voice told me twice or thrice a week that I, Joan, must go away, that I should raise a siege to the city of Orleans. And me, I answered that I was a poor girl who knew not how to ride or lead in war." Often, when the call is given, the future hero refuses to heed it. Call it fear or a sense of inadequacy, or in today's term, we call it imposter syndrome. Whatever it was, Joan wrestled with it for 3 years until she acknowledged us. So for those of us who don't believe in angels or saints or any of the mysticism that is so richly entwined with Joan's story, let's just call her angelic voice's intuition or inner knowing, or as Joan actually called it herself, she said, my counsel. So from her own admission, Joan had become adept at listening to her own counsel from within. So the first pathway Joan opens for us on a journey to radical personhood is learning to shut off the voices of self-doubt from within and to trust our own counsel. Believing in her own counsel, she made the decision to step into herself, into her personhood. She took off one garment, that of the peasant girl, and put on, which no longer served her, and put on another, the armor and clothes of a man. Now imagine how strong of a person you become when you trust yourself and your inner counsel, and you step into it and embody it. I mean, we do that in some way today, call it putting on a power suit, or dressing for the job you want. Now, it may have been easier for Joan to claim this vision of herself because there was this prophecy floating around in France. It was well known across the country that a young girl, a maid or a virgin, would come, would carry arms, and would free the kingdom of France from its enemies and crown the king. So this prophecy actually acted like a want ad. Position for mystic open in the royal court. Qualified candidates apply at your local church. A French historian reported it in the year 1428 alone, when Joan was 16 and already on her way to meet the prince. Some 20 people, most of them women, publicly claimed to have been chosen by God to deliver a message to the king. And this was just a number of recorded instances. So what made Joan so special? Was she really chosen by God? Was she the woman prophesied to save France? Was she a great mystic? Or did she just do what most people don't? She believed in herself, and she aligned her actions with what she believed and followed through. As she testified, I believed it, and I had the will to believe it. Joan's pathway to radical personhood shows us that it takes commitment and aligning our actions to our beliefs about ourselves. Was this unusual in her time? Yes, this was totally radical to claim any agency in a system fully flanked in hierarchy, and frankly, it is still radical today. So Joan's first victory was actually relatively minor, but wildly strategic, because she used this minor victory to shift the mindset of the French army and ultimately shift the military equation in France's favor. Now, up until her arrival, the French were despondent. Their military campaigns had been complete disasters. But she continued to lead the troops in a series of minor victories that restored their confidence and reinforced a mindset so they could eventually take on and succeed in a larger battle. Brilliant. Untrained and unschooled, she bested nobles and military commanders in her approach to the Battle of Orleans, which, after being stalemated for 6 months, finished in 4 days. So if you want a job done, we know, just give it to a woman, right? The French commander, many, many years later, reflecting on Joan, noted, her contribution was that she roused the fighting spirits of the French, which had lain dormant for so long, and this contribution was decisive. Don't take this to mean that Joan was a mascot. She was much more than that. She was a leader whose charisma captured the popular imagination, rallied the troops, and terrified her competition. She was genuinely in the front lines, leading her troops on horseback with a lance. She was followed because of what she believed to be true about herself and because of what she was capable of. After her victory at Orleans, Joan led a series of battles en route to Rheims where Charles VII was crowned king, and she held her flag high. When challenged on why she proudly waved her flag, she reminded the accusers that she did the work and she deserved the reward. So we'd like to think that Joan would have been promoted if she was in our organization in the 21st century. But then, as now, we have a practice of not recognizing certain types of accomplishment because of the person who does it. Joan nonetheless claimed her personhood and worth. Of course, knowing and claiming her worth really pissed some people off, namely the English, who had lost arms, men, and most importantly, let's be honest, they lost faith. Up until Joan, a young woman, they had basically steamrolled France. So from mocking Joan, the English now feared her, believing her to be a witch. How else could a teenage girl defeat the glorious English army? And this is where the narrative is actually so astounding, because in life, she was revered by the French, believed to be sent by God, the woman of the prophecy. To the English, this same woman was in consort with the devil, a witch wielding demons in battle. Joan just couldn't win. And once captured, the English knew they had to take her down where she was most vulnerable, by discrediting her extraordinary achievements, resulting in her personhood being taken away. Hell hath no fury like the English army scorned by a woman. One of the main crimes her persecutors pursued is that by claiming to have some direct connection with her inner council, she was bypassing church hierarchy and undermining the very basis of authority of the ruling class. Because she trusted her own counsel, she went over their heads. And that could not be tolerated. It's like she got direction from the CEO when her manager said, "How dare you talk to the power broker?" The fundamental issue was that she was willing to do the radical thing and trust her own judgment rather than do what other people told her to do. A second apparent crime was her male attire. During her trial, her accusers were fixated on her choice of clothing. Has much changed for women in public life since the 15th century? I'm not sure. But her choice to cut her hair and wear men's clothing was the announcement, essentially, of her refusal to abide by medieval expectations for women and to choose to be her own person instead. So as we know, Joan died a villain, a heretic. The English ran an unfair ecclesiastic trial, found her guilty of 12 counts of heresy, and burned her as a witch. 20 years later, after the French had driven the English finally out of France, King Charles VII had her heresy verdict overturned. She was venerated, returned to the status of mystic and blessed by God. So the English would have you believe that Joan was, this is a quote, "a pernicious temptress, presumptuous, credulous, a false prophetess, a blasphemer, seditious, schismatic, only able to achieve victory in concert with the devil." The French would have you believe that she was touched by God, separate and above the rest of us, exalted, only able to achieve what she did through divine grace and intervention. Modern historians, psychologists, and even neuroscientists have weighed in on Joan's legacy and totally pathologized her. They would have you believe that Joan likely suffered from epileptic hallucinations, was schizophrenic, bipolar, suffered from bovine tuberculosis, Meniere's disease, and most people just think she was actually crazy. None of them would allow you to see Joan as a person. None of them would allow us to see a brilliant, charismatic, young girl who had the presence of mind and strength of will to listen to her inner counsel and to take action, and to do that, win a war that was unwinnable. Now, what if that had been the story? What if we were to tell the truth and claim the power and pathway that Joan has opened for us? When we see Joan not as a witch or a heretic or a psychosis, but as an accomplished person, she gives us permission to step into our own radical personhood. Maybe like Joan, you have a desire to do something entirely unconventional, and you think, "Oh, if I give voice to this, people in the boardroom will think I'm crazy." Joan's journey to radical personhood shows us that no, it doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like you found the person you want to be or the thing you want to do. By finding the courage to listen to our own counsel from within, aligning our actions with what we believe about ourselves to be true, doing the work, and claiming the worth, we can access the full spectrum of human potential so we can all step into our own radical personhood, as Joan did 600 years ago. Thank you.
Well, Kadie, did you ever deliver on the promise to tell us that story in a way we've never, as I said before, deeped it before?
Thank you.
That was excellent.
Thank
It was
you.
excellent, excellent, excellent. And they've got a number of takeaways. One of the things that's really resonating with me is when you said the power and pathway that Joan opened up for us. And like I said, I know the story, but I have never really reflected on the story in the way that you've told it. Because when you really think about Joan's reference to her inner counsel, and how many times have we overridden that intuition, that voice that we have, that natural desire that we have based on our sense of purpose in the world and what we have to offer. And we tend to override it. So just to bring that story to our contemporary reality, What would you say are some tactics, tips, strategies to override this voice that holds us back oftentimes, well, too many times?
This is the resistance thing that's kind of a thread that's come through, because there is resistance to different types of thinking, right? And I didn't have a lot of time to go in the full story. Like, she didn't just walk into the French army and say, I'm here, you're safe. Like, she had to fight to get the attention to be able to lead, and they were kind of like, we have nothing to lose, we're doing so poorly anyway. But it's just fighting the resistance. And I think, it's very easy to get defeated, but finding and examining yourself, because there were moments in her story and in our own lives where you go, is this like true? Like, am I hallucinating? In her case. So it's finding that point of resistance and learning just to keep going and getting settled into it. And she made a commitment. She cut her hair. She changed her clothes. She started to identify as a man, and part of the artwork I created is this sort of non-binary piece, because I think she might even be our first publicly litigated non-gender conforming person. Like, you can, that's a whole other narrative.
Yeah.
Because she committed so much, and I think that's something that we've all faced, that we commit, and then we face the resistance and we go, oh, this is really hard. And that's fine, but then that's a sign to you that maybe that wasn't the thing. I think when it's there, you're going to do it. And that, to me, the tip is like, okay, acknowledge the resistance and decide whether or not it's worth it for you to keep going. To say, am I in this or not? Am I putting on the armor and cutting my hair, or am I putting back on my peasant dress and going back to the field? Like, just, you need to decide with that resistance is going to be something you're willing to face. And then find the people.
Yes.
Who will champion you. Joan actually had people championing her along the path to get to the prince, to get to the right people saying, this girl has something, listen to her. So to find the champion that's going to help build you up and help open doors.
100%. And you know what? That really is a formula for combating the internal resistance that we face. But it's interesting, amidst all the celebration that we should partake in and acknowledge in how far we have come, we're not only dealing with the internal resistance, but we're also, I would say, in an era of backlash. And we have to be mindful of that as well. I mean, when you think about, there are a number of companies right now that are ditching their EDI programs. You hear things that are kind of oftentimes wafting up from the south of us, that DEI actually stands for didn't earn it. It's so, I'm sorry to have broken that news to you. But I'm just scratching the surface. I was actually speaking at a conference this morning about that. And, we have to double down. Mm-hmm. We have to rely on that inner counsel, but also that belief. Yeah. So how would you say we should source our people to make sure that we have that strength to move forward? I mean, this is an example of what we're doing right here, but just on a day-to-day basis.
I think you have to be willing to share your troubles, your visions, your dreams, your ideas, and be willing to get feedback you're not interested, like you don't want. But then you go, that's not my person. Like, even when I was launching Garden of Eden, there was a lot of people who were like, I don't get it. And I'm like, well, this project's not for you, see you later. So I think you need to, but I think that's part of it. I think sometimes we need to learn, when do you internalize the message and when you don't. You go, oh, it's not for you, moving on. And I think that's part of, the resistance. Sometimes I actually think resistance, actually all the time, having worked in the countries I've worked in, resistance is usually a sign that it's working.
Absolutely.
People don't like change. People don't like to be confronted. People don't want to think about things that make them uncomfortable. So usually, to be honest, in my work, I usually try to find the right balance of resistance and acceptance, because I know if I'm getting a bit of resistance, then I'm reaching a boundary. And the pushback, I'm thinking about, even to bring it to Joan into it a little bit, like, she wrote a letter to the English that was like, okay, surrender, like, God sent me and you're basically screwed. And they, the name calling, I have a list, and I didn't read it today, but I have a list of all the names she's been called, and it's disgusting. And it obviously, and as women we know, it goes straight to her sexuality. It goes right to her fecundity. It goes right to all of the things, slut, whore, and I'm like, wow. And I think when you see that type of behavior, you're scaring people, which to me, I always, and maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but I go, I'm probably winning if I'm scaring them.
Yes.
So I think this is a mindset thing. And so for me, it's finding the mindset and then finding the people. So how do you find the people is you talk about it. And the people who just brush you off, don't think it's great, like, don't be offended. Just be like, thank you for letting me know you're not interested. I'm not wasting time with you anymore. And that's a mindset thing, right? You find this person's not into it. I respect their opinion, moving to the people that are. And I think you have to have the confidence to talk about it.
It's interesting, when I was getting ready to come here, I was talking to my 95-year-old mother who lives with me. So she was born in 1929. And I was explaining the event, and I mentioned that you were going to be doing a keynote on Joan of Arc. And she said, why Joan of Arc, dear? She knows the story. And I said, well, there's going to be a twist to this story, so I'm going to come back and tell you why after I speak to Kadie. So how did Joan of Arc, how did Joan of Arc get on your radar as a source of inspiration, and for us to really look at what personhood means?
Well, I wanted to include Joan in the Garden of Eden initial exhibition that I created 9 pieces there in the reception hall. Everyone can see them because she is so well known, and I think her story is so misunderstood. Like it's the, you know, she's a witch, a whore, or the exalted one, which I think that's basically women's 3 options in life, right? Like, so, watch any Hollywood movie. Like, here, pick your spot. So I just thought it was so interesting, as I said in my talk, like the English, the propaganda was like witch, heretic, bad. And the French propaganda was like exalted one, so amazing. And then historians were like psychotic one, which is also another, okay, it's 4 categories for women. So, so she was on my radar, and I created the piece really exploring a lot of her gender identity, because a lot of her text talks about how she just, like, God told her, like, to behave as a man. And I thought that's really interesting that she's like talking about gender in this way. But then as I got into the story more, I was just shocked on the, as I said, the power and pathways, her story act, because we don't hear that. We don't ever hear a story of Joan, like we don't teach Joan of Arc as like this brilliant military strategist from the 15th century that ended the turned the 100 Years' War. We hear saint or witch or whatever. So I wanted to make that story apparent that like we're not allowed to see her as a person. We only see her as these options. And she was just a really radical person. Like, she completely stepped into and embodied what she believed about herself to be true. And she accomplished what she set out to achieve by doing that. So that when I got into the story, because I honestly didn't really know what I was first going to write when I started researching her. I wrote the description and the title, and I thought, oh, let's see where this goes. And as I got in, I had a direction, but it changed as I got deeper, because I thought she was so committed. She was challenged by her accusers for months, and she was so committed to her vision. They couldn't break her.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, like, I just thought that's astounding.
Well, the way that you told this story, I totally feel like I've got to go back and do my own research again to just get further inspired, because you really are giving us different insights and different perspectives on a lot of the stories that have been mistold about women.
I think when I'll just jump in there,
Yeah.
because I think when we talk about systems change,
Yes.
we have to look at the stories we tell. And if we keep, like, there's so many stories where, like, it's the what if question that Samantha also fell in love with. Like, is that, and I also often ask, is that true? Like, I hear a story, because we are so in love with the sort of hearsay or the salaciousness of a story that we don't stop and ask, is that true? And I think if we just stopped and asked if that was true and dove into it, we would see a different narrative. But we don't challenge the narrative. And to talk about systemic change means changing the story. Like, we would have a very different world, even if today we started telling people, like, wasn't Eve the greatest of all time? She opened up our mind to knowledge and inquiry. And, like, if that became the narrative of 5, like the 3 faiths that are the largest in the world, or if young children or women learned that Joan was a brilliant mind. Like, I do believe that that changes behavior. So when we change the story, we can actually change. I've seen it. I've worked in massive countries transitioning from very different economic systems, and it's storytelling.
Storytelling, well, first of all, it can expose truths at a much deeper level, and it just resonates differently. But one thing that I'll say about you, again, I'm looking at you having my I dig this chick moment again, because you've given me a little bit of a window when we had lunch some months ago over kind of around your passion project, Garden of Even. And I do want to hear a little bit more about it in terms of where you're taking this, because I know you're asking the right questions and exposing a level of truth that we haven't been exposed to before. So tell us a bit about Garden of Even, a little bit more.
Yes, and everyone will get to experience it. It did start with, actually, it started with the realization that I was born in the 1900s, and some of you have heard me say this, which most people in this room were probably born in the 1900s. And at the beginning of 1900s, women were not persons. So it did start with the question, what if women had been considered persons before 1929? And I started like playing with that question, and then I was like, oh, we have to go way back, like to the Garden of Eden, where women were blamed for everything. And I say that if you don't come from a religious place or upbringing, you probably still are aware of the Garden of Eden and the story of Eve. It's like the most ubiquitous story. And you can trace, like we can trace so much back to that story, like even women's health, because in medieval times, because women were blamed for sin, like women's sexual health and childbearing was like nothing that they paid attention to, because they were like, well, she's a sinner and that's dirty. So like we can literally trace, there's a great essay called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses that traces like our medical system back to these beliefs that women were like sinful and shameful, so we really shouldn't invest like medicine and stuff into it. And we don't think like that. We don't go, oh, this belief is 1,000 years old and that's what shaped our system. That belief is 1,000 years old and it shaped the system. So I went back to Eve, and that was the first piece I created last summer, co-created with an artist. And then I started to try to move like this way. So I did Lot's wife and Queen of Sheba, because most people have heard of Queen of Sheba, because we say, who do you think you are? The Queen of Sheba? And we use it to call women out for knowing their worth, right? Like if you're confident, or if you're on your game, it's like, well, who do you think you are? The Queen of... Yeah, I am a Queen of Sheba.
I've never thought of that, I remember hearing that when I was younger. Who do you think you are, Queen of Sheba? It's like...
It's the moniker to shame women who get too high on themselves, right? We might call it the tall poppy syndrome. So to say like, well, who was the Queen of Sheba? And what did she do? And how has the propaganda or the story shaped what we believe about her? And so I did Sheba, I did Ruth and Naomi, I did a bunch. Jezebel was another one. Many people know the name Jezebel. It's a moniker. And then I jumped a bit at centuries, because that's a long time ago.
Yes.
And I did a couple of more modern ones, like Joan of Arc, Tahiri from Iran, because they're such an important moment for women in Iran now. And she was a emancipated woman, and she was martyred for her emancipation, but she was strangled to death with her scarf, which she refused to wear. And she said, you can kill me, but you can't stop the emancipation of women. And that was so powerful when I read her story, and just reverberated, because today what's happening in that part of the world, her story has to be told. So I created these pieces. I worked with artists, intersectional artists, to bring, if the women we were retelling the story were racialized, I tried to work with an artist who came from the same heritage, so that we could make sure that it was authentic in the representation. And so 9 pieces are out, and I hope to grow the pieces, have more talks like this. There's at least 9 lectures, many, many more, because I've played with lots of different angles to tell these stories, but it's about getting the content out there so we can learn new narratives, because ultimately I want us to know we can rewrite our own narratives. Like the story, even we are telling to ourselves about ourselves. Is it true? Like, check it, right? Like, where did I get that idea? How is that embedded in my psyche, and where did it come from? So I'm using and hoping to say, if we can look at stories, women whose stories have been used historically to defame women, like even Joan, witch or martyr, like witch or saint, like none of us can aspire. I mean, maybe you want to be a witch, I'm fine with witchcraft. But we don't aspire to, like those things. So I think it's more, when we know the stories, it gives us permission to step into our power, our knowing, our worth, and claim it. And these stories have been used for centuries to defame women, to say your contribution wasn't that great. Queen of Sheba, meh. Like actually she was like the greatest African queen of all time. He like bested Solomon and he was upset, so he changed the narrative to make her sound pretty horrible. So when we know that version of Sheba, like, and think about like, how would the world have unfolded if 3,000 years ago a black African queen had been lauded for her wisdom? Right? Like we would have a totally different view of black African queens, women, black women, all women, right? So I think that's the story, is like that story was intentionally defamed to make her become something that we use to call out women's worth, and that's not her story. So I think if we find power when we reclaim that story and say, that's not who Sheba was, this is what she did, and this is her lineage. And that's what I want this project to do, is to bring those stories to the forefront so we can reclaim them for ourselves and reclaim them for the women, like behind us and ahead of us.
How do we stay, yes. So how do we stay tapped in, connected to what you're doing next and the journey you're taking us on with the Garden of Eden?
Thank you. Joining my mailing list, I think all of you in attendance, I've probably already added you because you would have received an email about this event, reminding you to come tonight. so you're on the list. So please do follow that, pay attention, share it. I would love to elevate the community. I think this really is a community, like I am so inspired that like Samantha heard this, was so inspired by it and was like gonna spin it out and do something amazing, like continue to do. And I'm very much about community, and like if you're inspired and you're like, I want to do something, let's talk, because I think there's a lot of opportunity to bring this to different places, to different audiences, and we can tie it into, like, you know, purposefully today I wanted to tie it into the human resources and the talent space, because this is about the way we see and judge talent and people. Because if you're bringing centuries of storytelling that's not true to the process, you're not able to see clearly. So I think this is part of that, is bringing the professional world, not just our personal spaces, but bringing it together. As Erin said, the professional is personal, the political is personal, it's all personal. So we can continue. So if you've got ideas, would love to have more events like this in partnership with other groups who are really drawn to the content and what we're trying to achieve.
Well, there needs to be more events like this, and this has to get out there. Well, you had me at hello, okay? So you're such a light.
To be fair, when they invited me onto the stage, I talked to the sound guy and I said, could you please play Dolly Parton's 9 to 5 as I walk out the stage?
It was perfect.
So Laura was a little caught off guard because like 9 to 5's playing and I come out and I'm like, yes.
And I was like, it went from, who is this chick, to I dig this chick. But honestly, you are on to big things.
Thank you.
And I know you're going to inspire many and really continue to put the wind in women's sails. I mean, we are moving forward. And I thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everyone. As we wrap up, I want to invite all the speakers to the stage, and please stay, Laura, as well. We're just going to go celebrate. There's amazing food and wine by Gusto Grapes. Gusto Grapes is a wine and education, women-owned business. All the wine is from women-owned wineries. If you're interested in purchasing bottles, you can do that, and 10% of the sales goes to the artists. I want to present Samantha with a copy of the Eve painting as a thank you. This was the first piece I created showing Eve opening up the world of possibilities to us. She's got some imagery of knowledge and wisdom, and of course the apple. So I wanted you to have that, as I know her piece in that conversation had such a huge impact on you. So thank you for your support. And to Seabrook Workplace Law, I know your partner is here. We could not have put on this event without you. So thank you for your support and for your brilliance. So thank you very much. And to all the speakers, thank you. So we invite you to head next door to the Great Hall. There's lots of food and music, and let's continue the conversation. I would love to hear from you what inspired you and how we can just continue the conversation together. So thank you for being here, for supporting Garden of Eden.